Hello, my name's Dr. Gail John, and I'd like to draw your attention to the wealth of research that's available regarding educational failure and trauma. I've been a qualified dyslexia teacher for over 2 decades. My interest in educational failure, looking at removing barriers and examining solutions, has been a passion for many, many years. I embarked on a doctoral research study which asked 3 questions. 1. What are the barriers that result in educational failure? 2. What are the consequences of educational failure? And 3. What user-led solutions can be developed? There's so much research about inclusion that's already been written from a policymaker perspective and an academic viewpoint. However, who was listening to the voice of the excluded? When I began to examine the statistics, homelessness, suicide, self-harm, links with dyslexia in the criminal justice system, psychiatric system, foster care system, rape, abuse, domestic violence, autoimmune, heart disease and other negative outcomes, it made me realise how important this research was. Since I wanted to listen to an unheard voice, I let these people just talk. I was very surprised at what I discovered. When I went back into the research literature, I found that there wasn't much information on such things as intergenerational trauma, teacher bullying, the links between trauma, dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions. All of these things were key themes. ACEs and trauma, missed assessment relating to speech, language, communication, additional learning needs, disabling learning environments, bullying, gaslighting and systematic abusive practice, damages to mental health, survival coping mechanisms and self-medication, the revolving door of cycles of oppression and intergenerational poverty, preventative medicine and restorative practice from a user-led perspective. For many of those who told me about their stories of education exclusion and failure, it appears that ACEs and/or intergenerational trauma negatively impacted their lives, which in turn hampered their educational and academic success at school. It soon became apparent that some of these young people were living in fear. A lot of them could not pinpoint where the fear had come from. However, living from a position of fear predisposes a person to experience more trauma because overreactions, crying outbursts and hypersensitivities will attract further trauma from bullies who will only need to say a trigger word or phrase to get the desired effect through activating the fear response and re-traumatizing the victim. Abusive personalities know that fear disables the language part of the brain, which means that when you have someone in fear, they're easier to control, manipulate and dominate. Here is what some of the participants said. I think they perceived me as an overreactor, but they didn't know the fear that the other kids were making me feel. I really felt that my education suffered. I was living constantly in fear. I was just really fearful and stressed pretty much all the time, and I had nobody I could really talk to about it. I decided to create trauma timelines with some of the participants, and this is what I found. They realised that they were overreacting in some circumstances, feeling anxiety, feeling worry and having reactions, but they couldn't pinpoint where these feelings had come from. Since I couldn't find any research literature or books on education and trauma or trauma and education, I decided to look for any courses to find out more. The first course that I went on was a course by Betsy DeTheri in 2017. It was an ACEs course. It examined the effects of ACEs on children. I attended another course hosted by Ron Coleman, where a lady on the course mentioned about how she had been affected by intergenerational trauma. Since 2017, many books have been written. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, she has written The Deep as well. She's also on YouTube. Dr. Gabor, he has written many books. How the Body Says No, about the effects of trauma on the body. one that's connecting trauma to ADHD. The Body Keeps the Score, another excellent book. Mindsight, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. Childhood Disrupted, How Your Biography Becomes Your Biology. Caroline Spring, Recovery, Voices in the Shadows, written in 2018. This provider has also written an excellent online course which can be accessed through the College of Life. So it didn't start with you. And this examines how intergenerational trauma can affect many, many generations. An extract from this book states that children of a parent struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder can sometimes develop their own post-traumatic stress disorder called secondary post-traumatic stress. 30% of children with a parent who served in Afghanistan developed post-traumatic stress struggle with similar symptoms. Intergenerational researcher Huda, who has done much research into intergenerational trauma looking at the children of concentration camp survivors, World War II. She found that children of post-traumatic stress-stricken mothers were 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. She found that children of survivors are 3 to 4 times more likely to struggle with depression and anxiety or engage in substance misuse and abuse when either parent struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. As someone with a background in special educational needs and as a specialist dyslexia teacher, I was especially interested between the similarities between the trauma response and the fear response of disabling the language area of the brain and dyslexia, where Orton's theory there is a disconnect between the 2 different hemispheres in the brain. I was also interested in the similarities between the trauma response and also ADHD. Given that a number of my participants had a diagnosis of ADHD, ASD, and also dyslexia, dyspraxia, and other neurological conditions. Given that the Dyslexia Handbook 2020 states that over 80% of young people with dyslexia are leaving school without a diagnosis, this in itself would be very traumatizing if a person is in a disabling environment who's not having their needs met. There's missed assessments, missed opportunities to provide intervention and provision. This in itself is extremely worrying and was highlighted in my research. I think if anything was picked up in school, I might have come out of school with an education. My mum thinks I had problems like dyslexia. I can't speak. I need speech therapy. I struggle to say certain words, read certain words. I haven't got a diagnosis or anything for this, but I've probably got ADHD or just ADD. Given the high proportion of statistics where we have a high percentage of people with dyslexia, speech and language difficulties, diction and history of abuse within our criminal justice system, our psychiatric system and our foster care system, we really need to prioritise being more trauma informed and compassionate in our responses to our young people. For what we do today will have a long-term effect for the future generations. Thank you for listening.